The Battle of Basra, the Battle of Camel. The Second Civil War in Islam. The Muslims had already fought one civil war during the Caliphate of Abu Bakr, the first Khalifa. Within the same generation, they now faced the grim specter of fighting another. The first civil war was waged by the government against some of its dissident subjects, the second civil war was waged by some of the dissident subjects against their government. Professors Syed Abdul Qadir and Muhammad Shuja'ud-Din write in their History of Islam, Part 1, Lahore, Pakistan. Aisha was returning to Medina from Makkah after Hajj when she heard the news of the assassination of Uthman, and the accession of Ali to the throne of Caliphate, whereupon she decided not to go to Medina, and to return to Makkah. Talha and Zubair also arrived in Makkah. Uthman's governor in Makkah was Abdullah bin Amir Hadrami. Marwan and other members of the Banu Umayyah were staying as his guests. All of them held a meeting and resolved that they would seek vengeance for the blood of Uthman. They raised an army in Makkah of 3,000 warriors, and decided, after some discussion, to march on Basra. They occupied Basra, seized the treasury, and they killed 600 Muslims whom they suspected to be opposed to them, and spread terror in the city. The quest of vengeance for Uthman's blood was only a pretext for war. It was a mask not only for the ambitions of the rebel leaders but also for their crimes. There was no way for them to disguise their intentions, ambitions and resolutions as well as their complicity in Uthman's murder except by claiming that they were his paladins. One thing that was clear to everyone was that if Ali was able to consolidate his government, one of the first things that he would do would be to institute investigations into the murder of Uthman, and it was inevitable that the trail of criminal prosecutions would lead to the rebel leaders themselves. The role they had played during the siege of the palace of Uthman was not hidden from anyone. The eyewitnesses were all present in Medina and they would have testified under oath what they had seen. For the rebel leaders, there was, therefore, only one way to forestall Ali and his inexorable justice, and that was to raise the cry of vengeance before he could set the apparatus of law in working order. This is precisely what they did. Some among them even admitted that what they were doing was to atone for their sins, and there was no better way to atone for sins than to wash blood with blood. They had killed one caliph, and now they were going to kill another. This was the only way, they argued, for them to win salvation. No one knows by what right Aisha, Talha and Zubair were seeking vengeance for Uthman's blood. None of them bore any relationship to Uthman. Each of them belonged to a different clan. Uthman's next of kin were his widow, Nayla, and his sons and daughters, and they were not seeking any vengeance from anyone. It was only after his assassination that Uthman found self-appointed paladins of both sexes, ready and eager to protect him. Aisha could not see Ali on the throne of Caliphate. Her hatred of Ali was overpowering. If someone other than Ali had become Khalifa, she might not have embarked upon the cynical adventure in which tens of thousands of Muslims were killed. Whereas, the real casus belli in her case was her undiluted hatred of Ali, she also found another reason to press the campaign against him with vigor. In the event of her success in removing Ali from the center of power, she was going to make her nephew and adopted son, Abdullah bin Zubair, the new Khalifa. Three of Uthman's governors who had been dismissed by Ali were Abdullah bin Amir Hadrami of Makkah, Ya'la bin Umayyah of Yemen, and Abdullah bin Amir bin Qurayz of Basra. After their dismissal, the first one stayed in Makkah, and the other two also came to Makkah. They brought the treasury with them. Some citizens of Makkah also made generous contributions to the coffers of the rebels. In this manner, the latter found the funds necessary to underpin their war. The rebel leaders held a meeting at the house of Abdullah bin Amir Hadrami, the ex-governor of Makkah, to decide what they had to do. An invasion of Medina, and a march to Syria, were considered but were not found practicable for various reasons. Finally, Abdullah bin Amir bin Qurayz, the ex-governor of Basra, suggested that they should go to Basra. This suggestion appealed to everyone, and was accepted by all. Talha eagerly welcomed it, and said that many families of his clan were living in Basra, and that he could count upon their support. The rebel leaders then worked out their strategy. First they would take possession of Basra. With Basra as their base, they would occupy Kufa where Zubair had many supporters. With Basra and Kufa in their hands, they figured, it would be possible for them to isolate Ali and Hijaz, invade his territories, defeat him, and wrest Caliphate from him. The professed aim of the rebels was to kill those men who had killed Uthman. The men who had killed Uthman were all in Medina, but his self-appointed champions were marching upon Basra 800 miles to the east, in Iraq. Talha and Zubair requested Abdullah bin Umar bin al-Khattab also to accompany them to Basra, but he refused to go. Aisha pressed Hafsa bint Umar bin al-Khattab and the other widows of the Prophet who were still in Makkah after Hajj, to go with her to Basra, and to take part in the war against the Caliph. All of them refused except Hafsa. She was willing to go with Aisha, but her brother, Abdullah bin Umar, forbade her to do so. Salma was one of the widows of the Prophet. Aisha sent her a letter in Medina inviting her to take part in her campaign. Salma replied to her as follows. O Aisha, have you forgotten that the Messenger of God had ordered you to stay at home and not to transgress the limits imposed by our faith? The jihad of women is in restraint. Their eyes should not be bold, and their voice should not be loud. Do you think that if the Messenger of God were to catch you racing camels in the desert, he would be very pleased? If I were to disobey my husband, I would never be able to face him again. Therefore, fear God at all times. It would be in your own interest to stay at home, and not to go on a wild adventure. Aisha had claimed that she was going on a mission of peace. If she was, then it was the strangest of all missions of peace. She was escorted to Basra by 3,000 warriors, bristling with deadly weapons, and thirsting for the blood of innocent Muslims. At length all preparations were completed, and the army of Aisha, Talha and Zubair, marched out of Makkah, with great fanfare, toward its distant destination, Basra. As the Maccan army was marching toward the east, someone raised the question who would become Khalifa in the event of victory over Ali. Talha's son said his father would become Khalifa, but Zubair's son countered him by asserting that his father alone would become Khalifa. An animated argument began which might have led to an exchange of blows between the two young men when Aisha arrived at the scene. She interposed between them and their supporters, and dismissed the uncomfortable question as being untimely. Though Aisha suppressed the question of leadership at the time, she nevertheless decreed that her nephew, Abdullah bin Zubair, would lead the army in prayer. This ordinance had special significance in the context of the times. On one occasion, during the last sickness of the Prophet, Aisha's father, Abu Bakr, had led some Muslims in prayer. The fact that he had led them in prayer was used, immediately after the death of the Prophet, both as an argument in his Abu Bakr's favor, and as his Abu Bakr's qualification to become Khalifa. Aisha loved her nephew, Abdullah bin Zubair, more than his own mother did, and she was determined to make him the next Khalifa. Upon her insistence, even Zubair had to stand behind his own son to say his prayers. As Aisha saw it, in the light of her own father's precedent, no one in the rebel army could claim that he had the same qualifications to become Khalifa as her nephew had, since he and he alone had led the army in prayer. The question of leadership was bugging Sa'id bin Az also. He took it up with Talha and Zubair, and the following exchange took place between them. Sa'id, if you win the war against Ali, who will become the next Khalifa? Talha, whoever is chosen by the Muslims, would become their Khalifa. Sa'id, when you left Makkah, you declared that your aim in waging war against Ali was to get vengeance for the blood of Uthman. If your aims have not changed, then you ought to make one of his Uthman's sons the new Khalifa, and both of them are here with us in the army. Talha, do you think that we shall bypass the senior Muhajirin and make one of your raw youths our Khalifa? Never. Sa'id then understood that the talk of seeking vengeance for the blood of Uthman was only a hoax, and the real aim of the triumvirs was to grab power for themselves. A distinguished visitor to the rebel camp was Mughira bin Shaba. He talked with Aisha and Marwan, and advised them to abandon their plan for the invasion of Basra. He said to Marwan, if you are going to Basra to hunt out the murderers of Uthman, then you should know that they are here in your own camp and not in Basra. They are the generals of your army. They killed Uthman because each of them wanted to become Khalifa. But they failed, and after their failure, they cooked up this story of seeking vengeance. But Aisha and Marwan had no intention to abandon their grand design of conquest. They did not accept Mughira's advice, whereupon he, Sa'id bin Az, Abdullah bin Khalid, and a few others separated themselves from the rebel army, and went to Taif. The rebel army resumed its march toward Basra, but a weird incident made it halt once again. As Aisha rode past a certain well in a village on the highway, some pariah dogs gathered around her camel, and began to bark at her furiously. Aisha put her head out of the litter, and asked the son of Talha if he knew the name of the village they were passing through. He said that they were passing through a hamlet called Hawab. When Aisha heard the name Hawab, she was thrown into a state of great agitation. She ordered her camel driver to make the camel sit, and said that she had to return to Medina immediately instead of going any further toward Basra. This sudden change of direction and destination by Aisha surprised the son of Talha, and he asked her why she could not go to Basra. She said that recollection came to her of a prediction of the Apostle of God, and she told him what it was in the following words. He, the Apostle, was with his wives one day, and addressing them he said, "A day will come when the dogs of Hawab will bark at one of you, and that would be the day when she would be in manifest error." He then turned toward me, and said, "Beware, O Humaira, lest you be that wife. And now I can hear and see that the dogs of Hawab are barking at me. So I am the one in manifest error." But Talha's son was not convinced, and said, "O mother of believers, pay no attention to the barking dogs. We have more important things to do. Let's, therefore, move toward the destination which is beckoning us from the east." But Aisha appeared determined to go back to Medina. Alarmed by her insistence upon returning to Medina, Talha's son called Abdullah bin Zubair hoping that he would dissuade her from deserting the rebel army. Abdullah bin Zubair arrived at the scene and he too heard Aisha's story. But he had to stop her at any cost. If she were to desert the rebel army, the whole effort of the rebel leaders to seize power would collapse there and then. Furthermore, they would have no place to go to. He, therefore, told his aunt that the village the dogs of which had barked at her, and had so visibly shaken her up, was not Hawab, it was some other obscure village. Aisha, however, was not satisfied, and declared that she would not go to Basra. Abdullah bin Zubair now had to take desperate measures to reassure his aunt that in going to Basra, she was not going astray, and that the barking of some stray dogs ought not to unnerve her. He then took an oath that the army had left Hawab far behind. He also rounded up 50 desert Arabs, brought them before Aisha, and all of them swore that Hawab in truth was very distant from where she was. Arab historians say that the testimony, which Abdullah bin Zubair produced before Aisha, was the first perjury in Islam. Tabari, the dean of the Arab historians, has also recorded this incident. He adds that through the efforts of her adopted son, Abdullah bin Zubair, and his 50 witnesses, Aisha was at last convinced that the dogs barking at her did not belong to Hawab after all, but to some other village. She dismissed the incident as a minor contretemps. Her conscience was salved, and she was ready to ride toward Basra. At this time, Ali was occupied in taking stock of the situation. Of all his enemies, he knew that Muawiyah, the governor of Syria, was the most dangerous, and he felt that he ought to give him his first attention.